Welcome to Reaction and to the latest edition of our show, Authors in Conversation, where today I'm joined by Brian Groom to talk about Northerners, a history from the Ice Age to the present day, an acclaimed new biography, the story of the north of England. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Ian.
So, where does this book come from? I mean, it's a very current subject, very timely for some of the reasons we'll get onto later, no doubt. The Red Wall, Brexit, questions of national identity being back in discussion. But what was the impetus for you in terms of writing this book?
Well, I first thought of it about 10 years ago. I mean, I spent most of my working life on sort of British and regional affairs issues. And as a kid, I was history mad. So I've kind of come back to that more as I've got older. And the two came together in my mind. It just became an obvious subject to look at. And I was astonished to discover that there had only ever been one previous general history of Northern England published, and that was in 1990. So it seemed like an opportunity and an omission. And then, as you say, I just hit very lucky on the timing, just as I was getting towards the crucial stage to it. Lots of exciting interesting things started to happen. So it for me, that came just at the right time.
Why should there be that gap, do you think? I mean, it is, as you say, that previous history in general history in 1990 is the last such book, and the first such book in a very long time. Why should something so interesting and important, the history of the North? I mean, so much of English history is in there. Why does it not? Why has it not just had more attention? Is it academic snobbery or dominance of the South?
Yeah, I mean, it's puzzling a bit why it wasn't done in all that time. There aren't actually that many books about the North as a whole published. And my fear was, and this one would be seen as kind of too local for the national and international publishing market, but at the same time, not local enough for the specialist local interest and local history press. But those that are published tend to be quirky personal memoirs or travelogues, like Stuart Maconie's or Pies and Prejudice, which is probably the most successful Northern book of the last 20 years. But why nobody did a serious history is baffling, because when I originally thought that the history would be a bit of the story, but there's lots of cultural and social stuff in there as well, and there is. But actually, there's much more narrative than I thought I would end up doing, simply because there's lots of it, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's a very strong story.
We'll talk in a moment about the origins of the North. But firstly, can you define for us what is the North? I mean, is this a geographic term? Is this to do with the type of farming land, sort of arable land to the south, something tougher in terms of landscape to the north? Where does the North begin and the south end?
Yeah, it's the two questions I often get asked are, where is the North and what is a Northerner? And they're often very controversial, often within the North. But I'm not accredited to issue passports, so I can afford to take a very liberal and inclusive view. So my definition is simply that the North is where the people who live in the place think they're in the North, and a Northerner is somebody who thinks of themselves as a Northerner. So it can include the diaspora and people born elsewhere, adoptive Northerners and things like that. After all, it's mainly a cultural question, because it's not been a defined government area since the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was a long time ago. And you've got the Scottish border was largely fixed in 1237. The sea down two sides, and there is a kind of broad grey area in the south of what you might call the North. Insofar as people have drawn boundaries over the centuries for one purpose or another, these have shifted around. So, for example, Cheshire today is counted as part of the Northwest for government and statistical purposes. But in Anglo-Saxon times, it was part of Mercia, not Northumbria. So that's a long and woolly answer. But basically, if you want to be a Northerner, you can be.
But then there is a fault line, and then quite a lot of Northerners live in London. But there is a fault line, isn't there, running from Dorset and up and across?
There is, yes, yes. And I think that is an important factor. It's some historians sometimes call it a Jurassic Divide. You've got a ridge of Jurassic limestone that stretches from Dorset in the southwest up to the Yorkshire coast. North and west of it, you tend to get what is sometimes called a highland zone, harder rocks, more suitable for pastoral farming, raising sheep and other livestock, and it grew through isolated farms and small hamlets. South and east of it, you tended to get richer farmland, whole villages forming, generally throughout most of history wealthier. So the North's had that to cope with throughout much of its history. It's an oversimplification. You've got farming areas in the north like the Vale of York and the Northumberland Plain, but these geographic factors have had a big influence, I think.
I said, one of the big messages of your book is really you deal with this sort of myth of the idea of the North as having been almost a barren wasteland, or forgotten, overlooked, uninteresting, until the Industrial Revolution comes along and supposedly transforms that. So tell us about the history of the North before that period, and the origin story.
Well, the first Northern we don't know exactly. He's probably a hunter-gatherer from a group ranging north looking for food during the last ice age about 500,000 years ago. Probably Heidelberg man, it's thought. The only evidence of that is indirect. There are some hand axes found in Warwickshire in the 1980s that are thought to have made of a kind of stone that's thought to have come from the Lake District, which suggests there were people in the Lake District. It must have been pretty difficult for them in this strange place, but sometimes they were driven out again repeatedly by the ice, but they kept on coming. And but the story really kind of picks up with the Romans. We know a lot about the Romans because they wrote everything down. It's fantastic. And under the Romans, the North was important partly because it was vulnerable. It was the border of the empire. So as I recount in the book, some 6 or possibly 7 Roman emperors spent time in northern England while they were running the empire. The first one was Hadrian, who came in 122 to build his wall. And that's a structure that was without parallel anywhere in the empire. But lots of them, they split, the Romans split in the 3rd century, they split the north into Britannia Inferior, which is northern England and Scotland, and Britannia Superior, which is southern England and Wales, into 2 separate self-governing provinces. Those names are because to do with geography, because Superior was thought nearer to Rome, so that's why it's not supposed to be a moral judgment.
There's not some implication about quality of farmland or how
I don't think
easy
so.
the population are to manage.
No, it's hard to know exactly why they drew the border they did. It's slightly different from the other borders that get drawn. So Lincoln was part of Britannia Inferior, so it was in the north. But Chester, which looks firmly in the north, was in Britannia Superior in the south.
Yeah. So the Romans have a big impact. What about the years after Rome? The Romans leave, the empire disintegrates or splits, or so there's a huge shift in European history. What happens to the North in the centuries that follow?
Well, there was a confused period, but at the end you started getting a lot of incomers from southern Sweden and northern Germany that we call Anglo-Saxons, and they were jostling for space for a little while with some Brittonic kingdoms, some ancient British kingdoms, but they rapidly came to the fore, and the kingdom of Northumbria that was formed, and mainly by linking what's now the northeast with Yorkshire, and ranging up to the Firth of Forth, was very powerful for a time. Some very strong kings. It vied with Mercia for control over other English kingdoms. And it absolutely transformed itself within a century from an illiterate pagan society into what's probably Europe's leading Christian intellectual centre. It produced scholars such as Bede and Alcuin. It sent representatives to the courts of Charlemagne, and it was on a sort of east-west axis from, it adopted the Irish form of Christianity. So it was on an east-west axis across Europe, and it was probably the dominant intellectual power in Europe for a short period. But it didn't last. It didn't. If it had lasted, then we'd be looking at a very different state of Britain today. I think you can imagine possibly a Northern England, Scotland country, or a whole Britain controlled from the north. But it didn't happen that way, partly because it was unstable. All these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, they had didn't have the infrastructure of a state, and they relied on the king winning territory and winning tribute from other kingdoms so he could reward his followers. And if he wasn't doing that, then other people came along and tried to steal the crown. And that's broadly what happened to Northumbria.
Yeah. And then after the Norman conquest, of course, famously, there's the destruction of the north. The north is treated very harshly. Does that help explain, do you think, the way in which we still see it to this day, that notion we referred to earlier of the barren landscape pre-industrial revolution?
Yeah, the William indulged in what's known as the harrying of the north. There were some serious revolts against him after he had taken power, and they mostly came from the north. So he wanted to deprive any future army of any resources to live on. So all the crops were destroyed. Some reports say 100,000 people starved. The truth of it's hard to tell for sure, but it looks pretty serious. And the kind of folk memory of that does still linger on. It gets mentioned sometimes in the present day. It got mentioned quite a lot in the 1980s when deindustrialization was happening. I mean, it's a long time ago, and it's hard to tell exactly how long lasting its effects were. The North actually rebounded quite strongly in the 12th and 13th centuries. Its population was rising at double the national rate. So maybe there's an element of recovery from it then, but it did become imprinted on Northern memories for centuries.
I mentioned it, I mean, jumping forward a long way, nearly half a millennia, but jumping forward to the Industrial Revolution. Tell us about the impact that had, or why does so much of that happen in the North, do you think, that inventiveness? Is it something, we'll come on to distinctive Northerner characteristics in a moment, but is there something inherently Northern about the process?
I think there is, yes. I mean, there's a debate raging among economic historians for decades about why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain. The Victorians like to attribute it to the genius of British inventors. North had loads of those: Richard Arkwright, James Hargreaves, George Stephenson, the whole range of them. But modern theories center on things like relative wage levels and the attractiveness of capital spending against other countries. But it's easier in a way to see why the North became important when it did happen in Britain, because all those geographical factors we just described, which were a disadvantage up to that point, suddenly became in some ways an advantage, particularly for cotton and wool. You had rivers, you had a damp climate, very good for spinning. It had coal, it had iron and salt and other resources it could draw on. And importantly, it was mostly close to Liverpool, where it had access to slave-grown cotton, first from the West Indies and then from America. So all these factors that making life difficult for the North before actually worked in its favour during the Industrial Revolution.
So this extraordinary transformation happens. How is the North viewed in that period by, for want of a better term, the establishment? But the capital is London. A lot of financial trading is there. It's the political heart of the country. It's where the monarch tends to spend a lot of their time. How does that South view this explosion in Northern activity and prosperity?
With some puzzlement, I think, we learned from the writings of people like Dickens that it's kind of northern iron masters when they suddenly appear in novels, these exotic figures with backstories, and so it all seemed a bit strange. And it probably didn't. It disturbed the South in several ways, I guess. One was that the industrialization killed off quite a lot of industries in the South, which became uneconomic. A lot of places that relied on weaving and spinning and things in the south of England suddenly lost their livelihoods. But it didn't actually disrupt the social structure and accumulated wealth of the South. Even though the North was growing much faster and acquired some millionaires, most of the millionaires lived in the South. They had lots of lands, they'd accumulated their assets over centuries. So from that point of view, it took a lot to impress what was happening in the North on the establishment's mind, I think. Particularly the sudden growth of the industrial cities and towns, which were mostly without representation in Parliament, was a big factor behind the pressure for representation, which led to events like the Peterloo Massacre, and eventually to the 1832 Reform Act. But it did take the North to assert itself to try to get that across.
What's the you mentioned it there in terms of 1832. What's the political character of the North in that period, during and immediately after the Industrial Revolution?
The whole first half of the 19th century was a very turbulent time. It was turbulent across Britain and across Europe. The Napoleonic Wars. There was a major eruption of a volcano in Indonesia, 1815, that led to the so-called year without a summer. There were bread riots. And on top of this, in the North, there was the representation issue and things like the Corn Laws introduced at the end of the Napoleonic Wars to keep the price of bread high. So this was a particularly turbulent time. I mean, the North is famed for, during the industrial period, producing quite a lot of radical movements. And it wasn't always terribly coherent. So the more working class ones were things like the Luddites, which didn't really succeed. The Chartists, who did in the long term succeed in getting most of their aims through. Well, slightly separately to that, there was the employer-led campaign to abolish the Corn Laws, where the interests of both the employers and the workers came together, because it's keeping the price of bread high. For the employers, it was making labor expensive and making their goods expensive. For the workers, they were often going hungry. So it came together then. But I think at the time, it was just a fervor of all these things going on, and nobody knew whether all the changes that are going on around them were going to lead to the kind of changes we've seen it produce in the long term, or whether it's just going to lead to starvation.
Yeah. So there's a long-running debate about how Northerners view Southerners and the other way around. There are divisions, aren't there, within the North, and there's. You list some very funny nicknames from one part of the North for other parts of the North. But George Orwell in Road to Wigan Pier, so he described the North as having grit. He is grim, dour, plucky, warm-hearted and democratic. The Southerner, by contrast, is snobbish, effeminate and lazy. How much do you agree?
I don't, in the book, actually try to define Northern characteristics. I'm quite wary of generalizing about personal characteristics of wide groups of people. There tend to be it's not to say there is no identity, but the North has suffered so much from stereotypes, often perpetuated by Northerners themselves. That I'm a little bit wary. There's obviously there is a pan-Northern identity, and the list you've given certainly is part of the Northern self-image. I'll give you another little list I got here, which is from an earlier book by a chap called Dave Russell called Looking North, which was about the culture of the North, came out in the early 2000s. And he listed characteristics as seen by Northerners as characteristics as seen by outsiders. And they're the same ones. So in the Northern self-image, they were independent, blunt and straight talking, hardworking, physically tough, competitive, practical, productive, careful with money, friendly and hospitable, proud of roots and identity, meritocratic, knowledgeable, humorous and witty. And the Southerners' view of those would be truculent, carrying chip on shoulder, rude, lacking social graces, hardworking, over-competitive, ungentlemanly, philistine, or unpolished, albeit highly musical, mean, homely, parochial, working class, prejudice, humorous if crude. And they are kind of two sides of the coin, but it's all a matter of perception. I think it does exist, but I'm wary of just applying big broad labels to people.
And you mentioned there, used the word musical there, or David Russell used the word. I mean that is something really interesting. It happens after the Second World War, or arguably maybe it even comes in with some music hall and the beginning of cinema. But just the cultural dominance in terms of popular culture of the North in the 50s, 60s, and even beyond that as well. Just thinking in terms of football, the glamorous side of football, thinking about music, the Beatles, playwrights, this sense of the North having an identity that's tougher, distinct from the South, and more modern. Why does that happen?
Why is always the hardest question, Iain. I think there's a route going a bit further back. It's easier in a way to understand why, when the leisure sector started growing in the 19th century, when incomes were rising, people were getting some leisure. A lot of music hall performers came from the North, a lot of music hall growing from there, and you started to get the growth of Northern comedy, and from that, I think you can see rooted in people being thrown together in difficult circumstances in the Industrial Revolution and developing a coping strategy. You saw it in Glasgow as well. But why the North, as you say, with music and films and books just after the Second World War is a little bit harder. I guess it has to do generally with the war creating a more egalitarian spirit. It caught up even conservatives like LS Lowry got a bit caught up in the post-war enthusiasm for a more democratic culture. But why specifically pop music? Why Liverpool initially? Why then Manchester and later on Sheffield and places? That's a bit harder to pin down.
There is also in that same period, I'm thinking of the writing of Melvyn Bragg or Parkinson's performances and writing as well. There is this process of discovery. Critics would say, some critics in the South would say it's a kind of professional Northerner shtick, slightly unfair, but there is this process of rediscovery and asking what the North means, isn't there, in the 60s, 70s, and then the 80s we'll come on to in a moment. It's a different question.
Yeah, well, the Arts Council in England was formed in 1946, and it specifically had a remit to support the arts in the region. So I think that did help to create the kind of upsurge of theatre we saw in the North. And in the late 50s and early 60s, the North was briefly terribly fashionable as part of the whole kitchen sink drama thing. So you got writers like David Storey and John Brain and Sheila Delaney, and the plays were made into films. It didn't last very long, but it was a big thing for a while. And the Beatles came along towards the end of that period. So it's curious in a way that it was becoming culturally fashionable at a time when its industries were slowly dying. And the kind of underpinning of the whole region was was crumbling, which eventually I think caught up with it.
Because the decline, much debated, why did it happen? When precisely did it start? I mean, I found it very persuasive, the idea that the roots of it are very deep, going back even before the First War. Just when you look at what how German industry was developing in terms of chemicals, the industries of the future, and then also you had, I was talking to Helen Thompson on this program last week, you had this shift from coal, which had been the 19th century energy form, source of energy. The 20th century was going to be a century of oil, and America had lots of it. And Britain and the North, where so much of its industry was coal dependent. So the origins of that decline, it certainly doesn't start in 1973 or 1979, does it? It's much deeper.
No, a lot of I think a lot of complacency set in. In fact, one set of economic historians' figures I use in the book that suggest that Britain was actually the number one global manufacturer only for about 60 years before America overtook and Germany started rising, and it's definitely losing relatively by the late 19th century. There was a lot of complacency in the northern industries during that time. I think it's partly to do with the fact that we had the era of globalization in the late 19th century and very buoyant world trade, and they were all doing well. They were making money hand over fist. It seemed great. But actually all that while that was going on, the North's industries were losing competitiveness. They weren't adopting new technologies. Things like the Northrop loom in America came in, and Britain stuck with its existing looms. And by the First World War, really, they were looking, these industries were looking pretty shaky. And straight after the First World War, you were into deep trouble.
When the 80s hit, then all of that comes to the surface, doesn't it? It is a very dramatic 4 or 5 years where deindustrialization accelerates, and there's a shift which you describe in the book of the South becoming in the 80s, which had been maybe a bit sort of lazy and complacent or perceived to be economically, becoming more entrepreneurial, actually more kind of northern in some of its attitudes to commerce and invention and innovation, and the North sinking.
Yeah, I think that's true. If you looked at some of these lists of characteristics, you find the earlier lists of the northern ones always included entrepreneurialism because of the everything had done in the Industrial Revolution. You certainly wouldn't have said that was true by the 1980s. And the south of England, which had been seen as a kind of slightly sleepy, ineffete agricultural and service-based economy, was actually producing new businesses, quite strong new businesses. So there was a reversal there. I think there has been some improvement in the north since then, particularly in big cities. You are seeing more entrepreneurialism, but it's still patchy.
But it's the decade of there's this oddity, isn't there, culturally in the 1980s. I was just thinking when you mentioned that idyll or that view of southern England, I was just reminded there of, say, Howard's End, and that merchant ivory aesthetic. So the South is presented as kind of idyllic, the idyllic village life. Do you think that what happened to the North in the 80s and 90s, though there's been a huge shift, as you rightly said, since, could have been avoided in some way, or was what happened with Thatcherism just really finally, her defenders would say, someone finally faced up to that reality of 170 or 80 years of decline and attempted to make a new economy? Was there some kind of middle way, do you think? If there'd been a different government in place, could more of that industry been saved and reinvented?
I tend to look at it over a 20-year period, stretching from Thatcher through to New Labour. And throughout that period, you saw broadly the similar level of industrial jobs being lost. My guess, it was particularly sharp in the early 1980s. There probably would have been ways of avoiding it hitting quite so hard at that point. Whether that would have saved the North from the decline over 20 years is another matter, because Britain had a very sharp recession in the early 1980s, but it was recovering from it earlier than other countries as well. So it may, to an extent, have been a question of timing. Virtually every other Western industrial nation has had a similar drop in industry as a proportion of its economy, including America and Belgium and France. Germany's the exception. Even Germany has come down from about 30% of GDP to about 20%. And they've now got the issue of whether they are high-tech enough for the modern economy. So given the growth of free trade and globalization after the Second World War, I think most of the roots of what happened were so deep that it was going to happen in some way over some time scale anyway. I can't see a scenario in which factories like my dad's sewing factory in Stockport, which was like Mike Baldwin's in Coronation Street, would still be working today. All those kind of businesses were going to go, I think, sooner or later.
Yeah. But there has been then, in the last couple of decades, despite all of the other economic challenges that the country has faced, there has been this extraordinary revival in the fortunes of cities such as Manchester, which is a fantastic place. Cannot get enough of it visiting. Newcastle, Leeds is thriving. Liverpool has undergone the beginnings of a transformative regeneration in the city. These places, I suppose, will be really hit if we have an economic downturn, because that retail is now more important and services are more important. But something has happened to these places, hasn't it?
Yes. And I wouldn't have predicted these things happening from the early 1980s, when everything seemed pretty dire in these cities, and cities around the world at that time. Like New York was in serious decline. So the big cities were definitely on their way out there, and they've got their act together well. And the key features of it were, well, for one, important what was the local politicians embracing partnership with the private sector. That certainly happened in Manchester, first under Graham Stringer in the late 80s, so that was important and central. You need the three partners, really. You need local politicians, the private sector, and central government, all working together. Even then, success is not guaranteed. You have to have the right policies, the right level of investment, things like that. But I think they're probably the bedrock of any successful regeneration effort we've seen around the world.
What about then levelling up? We've heard so much about that phrase in recent years, with the Tories pledging apparently to level up. Well, I mean, what we've just mentioned there. Sometimes when I go to somewhere like Manchester, I think, well, it's already happened. I know there are still enormous challenges, but the Tory parties may be missing something that's already underway. How credible do you think it is? What does it mean? Various documents have been published. Do you think there's something? Are they onto something? Will it work?
I like to be optimistic where I can, but it's hard to be on this one, I think. In the book, I look at all the similar efforts to close the North-South divide since the 1920s. They started with Stanley Baldwin's Industrial Transference Board, which was aimed at moving people from the old industries to new ones. Probably very well meant, but it got criticized at the time for encouraging people to leave the depressed areas and robbing them of their most talented people. So most of the schemes that have been over the decades since then have tried to bring work to the depressed areas rather than the other way around. And some of them have worked a bit for a while, but they've all been, often they've been half-hearted and inconsistent, and they chop and change all the time. That's another problem, that they change every time a new government comes in, something completely different happens. And even within the same government, when the Prime Minister changes, it all changes. So since the Conservatives have been in 2010, we've had David Cameron's rebalancing, which didn't mean a great deal. We had George Osborne's Northern Powerhouse, which did mean a few concrete things, but you hardly hear it mentioned anymore. And now we've got Boris Johnson's levelling up, and the analysis for it is strong. The white paper is very good on analysis, but whether it will result in actions that make much of a difference, I think that's yet to be demonstrated.
Yeah, it's difficult to envisage what would a very simple set of policies that a government or successive governments could stick to look like. If you contrast it with something like Beveridge and the reforms from he began his work in the early 40s, but then post 45, there's a set of policies which build a political consensus. I can't quite see what you could turn into how you could create a 5-point or 10-point plan, especially when there's disagreement in the north about what it means, isn't there? There are rivalries between Liverpool and Manchester. Different people want different centres want different things in terms of travel and investment. What's the read across, do you think, on Brexit, where it's such an interesting issue in terms of the north, the so-called red wall seats, which of course Theresa May actually came close to taking a lot of them in 2017. So something else is shifting there in the north that's deeper than just the 2019 election, a move away from Labour.
Yes, I think something deeper is happening there. I mean, we don't know whether the Conservatives' red wall gains will be sustained in future elections. As we stand today, you'd say that's questionable. After all, Tony Blair won a lot of southern seats in 1997 and 2001. Labour doesn't hold those seats today. It's not necessarily a long-term shift, but as a lot of people have pointed out, there has been a kind of underlying shift in loyalties. You've lost all the collective organizations, the big industrial workplaces, the working men's clubs, all the community things that tended to tie in with a particular voting pattern. A lot of the north has become more individual, people just often working for themselves, some better than others, but there isn't the sense of collectivism that there once was. And that makes it harder for certainly Labour cannot depend upon a class-based vote in the way they did for most of the 20th century, I think. So it's fascinating. It's still all to play for. And it ties in with the levelling up agenda, because if the levelling up agenda turns out to be just hot air, then the Conservatives' chances of keeping their red wall seats will not be good. And the Conservatives have their own ideological issues thrown up by all these changes. It's brought in the red wall seats have brought in a number of MPs who are not your typical small state, low tax Tories, who actually do believe in government intervention. So it's changed everybody's politics, and where it's going to settle and fall down to, I don't have any great powers of prediction, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Do you think, is there an agenda for Labour which is, I could see how it could almost be, I don't know if you've read David Edgerton's book about sort of war state and what happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I wonder whether Labour, because it has this problem, this disconnection problem, doesn't it now? Because it's led by an Islington lawyer. It wasn't a problem in Blair's case, but culture has changed. So the Labour leadership can seem quite remote. I wonder if Labour can put together a programme which is very much focused on infrastructure and essentially accusing the Tories of talking a good game but not actually really delivering. Now, of course, infrastructure is very expensive and not guaranteed to work, but I wonder, I could see a pro-Northern industrial strategy based programme from Labour maybe connecting.
Yeah, they would have to be carefully constructed, because the kind of massive rise in public spending proposed in 2019 was just not seen as credible. Yep. So they're gonna have, it's always a battle of priorities. So they're going to have to, before they commit to a specific infrastructure beyond what they've already endorsed, it would need a very carefully thought through program. But there must be an opportunity there for them to form that. I guess one danger for Labour is they don't want to be seen as a regional party. They still have aspirations. I mean, they do well in London and Bristol and places. They still want to be seen as a national party, but you're right. I think that there must be a platform there that could engage, and it would be odd, after everything we've seen in the last few years, if the North wasn't at the centre of the next election.
Brian Groom, final question: are you broadly optimistic? You said you like to be optimistic. Are you broadly optimistic about the prospects of the north of England?
Yes, on balance. As I said earlier, the revival of the cities took me by surprise. I don't think it necessarily means the whole of the north will be revived equally successfully. It'll probably be more stuttering than that. Some places have lost their economic purpose, and it's quite hard to devise a new one. But I think if the right decisions are made, if they're reasonably consistent, and if they acknowledge the role of Northerners themselves in deciding their future, these things really won't work if they're just decided by Whitehall. If all those things come into play, then I mean, hopefully in 20 years' time, we could be talking about some degree of recovery.
Brian Groom, thank you very much for joining us. I was talking to Brian Groom, Northerners, author of Northerners, A History from the Ice Age to the Present Day. You've been watching Reaction with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and this is the latest in our series of Authors in Conversation. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just click subscribe below. And if you're not a subscriber to the site and you want my weekly newsletter on politics and all the other work that the Reaction team produces, there are also details on how to become a subscriber below. But Brian Groom, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Iain.
And thank you very much for listening. Until next time.